So I'm a pediatric electrophysiologist by training. I have been practicing at Tufts Medical Center for the last 9.5 years. About 5 years ago, my CEO found me on LinkedIn and approached me about an idea that he had. And at that point, I was playing around with digital health, wearables, a lot of technology that was very, very exciting at the time in Boston and out here in San Francisco. And a lot of you in here are just starting to think about entrepreneurship. And certainly, when I first came out of residency and fellowship, I certainly did not have an idea that my career path would look like this one day. So I want to sort of introduce my company to you in a little bit of a storytelling way. So at the time that I came out of fellowship from pediatric electrophysiology and as a young attending, I was learning this stuff. Why was I learning this stuff? This is cardiac biomagnetism and learning about 3D cardiac magnetic fields. And I learned these great words like femtotesla. And what I was doing at the time was actually, as a young attending in Chicago, I was working with some amazing fetal cardiologists, and we were examining those fetuses for cardiac rhythm disturbances. And we were sending them up to Madison, Wisconsin, to this lab where they had this thing called a SQUID, superconducting quantum interference device. And it was a super cool machine with these magnetic sensors that were contained in this canister of liquid helium in a magnetically shielded room. And we could measure directly a fetus's cardiac waveform. And I could identify what arrhythmia they were having. I could identify whether they had long QT syndrome before they were born. And I was doing this, and when my CEO at the time called me, he said, "I understand that you've done this, and I have a question for you. I've developed this software program to measure current from a cell directly, and I can map it. How can I use this on a human being?" And I thought about it, and I said, well, I in fact have this technology that I work with, but it's a little bulky, and I don't think you're going to be able to scale it to anything. And so that is when I started advising the company. And ultimately, that's why a software company also became a hardware company. And that's the business that we're in, is magnetocardiography and applying innovative software and artificial intelligence to mapping magnetic fields from a human being's heart. So just a really basic sort of a course on magnetocardiography. This is the investor slide that, there's sodium and potassium, and I skip the action potential, for them. But what I tell them is, any sort of ion movement in and out of a cell creates a current. Cardiac cells depolarize and repolarize in sequence in a defined direction, and that creates a moving current through the myocardium. You can imagine certain structures, if you're a cardiologist in here, where you could see that a magnetic field will rotate around a certain linear current and create a counterclockwise rotation. And because the heart is three-dimensional electrical currents, you can get this toroidal in X, Y, and Z planes, and all through that three-dimensionality, you can get this measurable magnetocardiography signal. Problem is, the magnetic signal from a heart is about 1 trillion times smaller than the Earth's magnetic field. So you have to build a shielding. You have to use something that can accurately make sure that you gather that information. And so we use something which was on the first slide here, something in the bottom here in red called an atomic magnetometer. And those were really interesting advances because we could use those. They're about the size of like an old roll of film container. And we could put them in a grid, and we could build this shielding around it. And we could look at building this device and using it to map cardiac signals. And so we developed the CardioFlex magnetocardiograph. And those are the components in that device. And what we decided to do is to focus on cardiovascular disease diagnosis, specifically chest pain evaluation. So looking to rule out and identify acute coronary syndrome in patients, especially who were low to intermediate risk. High-risk patients who came in with a STEMI, they're going to the cath lab. But we wanted to look at this. Probably about 65% or so, 70% of the emergency room population that were coming in were being admitted to observation unit and had a nuclear stress test or stress echo the next morning, which is a very expensive test. And we wanted to give emergency room physicians and cardiologists a test that they could use at the point of care, especially some of the more complex patients who had comorbidities or reasons for their troponins to be equivocal or persistently high. And this was a rule out technique. So we had our FDA clearance, our first FDA clearance this spring. We have 2 CPT codes that we acquired, and we are undergoing 2 clinical trials, one with a 4-center multi-center trial and a single-center study that are looking at different aspects of coronary artery disease management and diagnosis. So what we wanted to do is about a couple of years ago as well is start applying AI to these magnetic field maps, and I'll show you those on the next slide. But that was something, because there was such a lack of awareness of this technology, and that's one of the barriers that we've certainly found in educating people how this works. But AI is actually a way to improve the learning curve for physicians and the requirement for them to understand, what this does, and improve adoption as we go forward. So it's a non-invasive test. There's no radiation. It takes 5 minutes to do for a patient. Doesn't even touch them. It's our first pilot as a rule-out tool for patients in observation had a 94% specificity and 96% negative predictive value. So the current trial we're looking at is a high-risk population that will bolster our statistics for positive predictive value. So here's an example of a magnetic field map. It's not that complicated when you actually get down to it. So when during the repolarization phase of the EKG, the cardiac signal from a magnetocardiograph creates what we call a dipole pattern. So it's a positive pole and a negative pole, just like the Earth's magnetic poles. In situation of ischemia, where there's almost instantaneous disruption of ion channel activity, those vectors from the magnetic field start to distort. And so on your left here, this is a normal single dipole. So there's a red positive pole, negative blue pole with stable repolarization dynamics. That was a patient who had negative cath, negative stress testing. The patient who had this magnetic field map from our device on your right, there is a distortion of the vector of the poles. So the negative pole is actually split into 2, and the positive pole is inserted into the middle with a diverging current there. That patient ended up having a 75% LAD stenosis that required intervention. So this is what we're continuing to explore with our current trials. We're going to be applying for an IFU application beginning of 2020, and we hope to be commercial in about a year. At this point, we're raising Series C to continue our commercialization strategy. Okay. Yes.
I understand that you have obtained a new CPT code. If that's correct, can you comment on how difficult it was? What did it take?
Yes, so the question was how difficult was it to get a CPT code and what did that take to obtain that? So the first piece of advice that I got when I went to the AMA meeting was don't talk too much. They'll shut you down. They will literally pull the plug on you. And it's like a congressional hearing. And you really have to boil it down to the technical fee is really sort of what you write in the pre-submission application. That kind of justifies your technical fee. What you're really doing in that meeting with the AMA is justifying the physician fee. And so you have to boil down the effort, meaning you have to almost talk in bullet points, exactly what the physician is required to do to open up your portal, look at your image, play the animation, freeze it in different time points, which our portal does, look at previous scans, and then write an interpretation. And so that is something that the AMA really wants to hear specifically is physician work. And so that's the key to sort of getting, it's not easy. They ask you to, compare your technology to an analogous diagnostic test. In our case, it was nuclear stress testing, so SPECT, for instance, and how our technology reflects that particular type of work in a different way. Obviously, we're not SPECT. It's not a nuclear-based technology, but it does boil down to those types of. And CMS will ask you to do the same thing.
One more question.
Okay. Oh, there's like 3 people.
On the screen on the right, you show that it's positive for ischemia. Will it show that on the EKG, or is it before the EKG changes?
So this is a patient who actually was admitted to an observation unit with no diagnostic EKG changes and no troponin elevation. Yes, and this was a 4th generation. It was not high sensitivity.
I'll have somebody.
So what are the space and shielding requirements, and what's the anticipated cost of?
Yeah, so the question is, what is a space and shielding requirement? So the shielding is self-contained. It's, you don't have to have a control room or magnetically shielded room, but the device with the bed fully extended, so it looks like a CT scanner in some ways, is about 20 feet. So it does require its own room, its own space, but it does not require any special infrastructure for that particular space.
Thank you.
The cost. So the cost for a device, this device is about $600,000. We're going to be bringing that down with our manufacturing strategy down to about $350,000 over the next year.
Thank you. Give that a round for-
Sorry, come out.